Hello, everyone, and welcome to the roundtable panel discussion on voting and the election, exploring balancing our rights, responsibilities, and obligations as Jews in America. This roundtable discussion is brought to you by the Talmudic University of South Florida and is anonymously sponsored for the unity of the Jewish people. I'm supposed to mention at this point that there's a big dinner coming up, the 50th anniversary Yovel dinner of the Talmudic University of South Florida. Ohad, I guess, will put the link in the chat for anyone who's interested in joining us at this momentous occasion, celebrating 50 years in South Florida, spreading Torah and building community. So my name is Gidon Fair. I'm a proud alumni of the Yeshiva. I was there for 4 years and a proud student of Rabbi Zweig. All of the Rabbi Zweigs, if you know the Yeshiva, there's a lot of them. And so I'm the moderator for the conversation tonight. So I'll just set the table really quickly. We wanted to have a conversation because it feels like a very important election. I don't know if anyone else is feeling this. And it feels like a very confusing time to be Jewish, to be American, to be a civic-minded person. So we wanted to bring the Jewish A-team of thinkers, of doers, of people who really have led the Jewish world. Apparently the official name is Talmudic University of Florida. I do apologize. So we want to bring the A-team together of people who have really taken the Jewish world and led it for the past many years. And so we've done that. We're going to have tonight a conversation about the election and about our Jewish responsibilities and our Jewish relationship to the civic process. But I wanted to stress something, that tonight is going to be nonpartisan. We're not here to attack any specific candidate or group of people. We want every person here, regardless of your Jewish or political affiliation, to feel welcome and to walk away with some tools to help you make the decision for yourself about who you will be voting for. With that said, I'm going to introduce our expert panel, starting with Rabbi Akiva Zweig, who is the Rosh Yeshiva and Rosh Mostos of the Talmudic University of Florida and affiliated schools. He has extensive experience teaching and applying Torah, Jewish philosophy, and ethics to the real world. And he's also my Rabbi, most importantly. We have Malcolm Hoenlein, who was the past CEO and executive vice chair of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish of American Organizations, and is currently the Vice Chair Emeritus of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. Dr. Hoenlein holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania from the Department of International Relations, a mainstay in political halls of power. He is the confidant of, I think, pretty much every U.S. president since Carter, maybe? He can correct us if I'm wrong, but basically since Jimmy Carter, including with the current president, President Biden. Dr. Hoenlein has been behind basically every single Jewish issue, fighting for our people for the last 30 plus years. There's a fantastic interview, which I highly, highly recommend. I believe on the Meaningful People channel. I think it's called Living the Chaim with Dr. Hoenlein. It's about an hour. It's well worth your time. So I do very much, you'll hear great stories about Dr. Hoenlein with every U.S. president, as well as with some people you might not expect. We're also joined by David Magerman, who is the co-founder and managing director of Differential Ventures, a data-focused venture capital fund, as well as founding the Kohelet Foundation, which is transforming education for Olim in Israel, among many, many other philanthropic ventures. David is one of the earliest employees of the legendary hedge fund Renaissance Technologies, serving in its management and research for over 2 decades. David received his PhD in computer science from Stanford on natural language processing. We have with us Josh Hammer for a return guest, Josh Hammer, who is a senior editor at large at Newsweek and host of the Josh Hammer Show, as well as America on Trial with Josh Hammer about the election season. Josh oversaw the expansion of Newsweek's opinion sections, which helped fulfill Newsweek's mission of platforming the full diversity of political viewpoints on a daily basis. Josh is a fellow at the Edmund Burke Foundation and the Palm Beach Freedom Institute. He is, as well as being a popular campus speaker. Josh earned his JD from the University of Chicago Law School. And finally, we have a surprise guest, Dr. Joel Finkelstein. Dr. Joel Finkelstein is the Chief Science Officer and Director and co-founder of the Network Contagion Research Institute, an organization dedicated to detecting and combating hate and extremism. He holds a PhD in neuroscience and psychology from Princeton University. He's also a senior research fellow at the Miller Center for Community Protection and Resilience at Rutgers University. His work has been featured in prominent media outlets, including the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR. So with that, Rabbi, I'm going to ask you to take the floor and intro us for about 5 years, for about 5 minutes on the topic that we're dealing with today, which is elections and voting. Because as all things, we start and begin and end with the Torah perspective.
Thank you so much, Giddy, and thank you so much to the co-panelists for participating tonight. I think this is really wonderful that in a matter of a few days, we can put together such an august group of speakers and many important participants and guests to join us, because it shows the importance of this situation, this election, and also this time in Jewish history. I think that the perspective that I'm coming from, as Giddy, you sent me earlier today, with Moshe Feinstein, who was the Gadol, the true giant of Torah of the last century, wrote the importance of an American citizen appreciating the good and the safe haven that America represented for the Jewish people, and that it is a true act of hakaras hatov to do the voting and the civic duties that are really the fabric of this country and that have represented such freedom for us Jewish people to practice our religion in a safe and protected way. And it's an important quality to build in all of us, appreciation, plus the impact that we can have as Jewish people in our own communities and culture, and the leadership that we can represent. Where I'm coming from, aside from that very, very important foundation, is that we, the Jewish people, have had a big, humongous wake-up call this last year. And it requires all of us Jewish people to become much more active and proactive in participating, not only in civic duty, but in Jewish conversation. I think if God wants anything from us, he wants us Jewish people to be figuring these things out together and working together to accomplish our Jewish mission. Specifically, when it comes to the arena of voting and the host of issues that face the world directly and also directly through the American nation and the power that it represents in the world, is how people need to become aware of truth, of good and evil, of what's really happening, what's being mortgaged in terms of future for temporary short-term gain. And the principle that the Torah teaches us is that human beings are given free choice, and that free choice is a huge responsibility. And that responsibility requires very careful thinking and examination of the realities of the world and how to choose. How should we choose all these very important issues that are facing us? And for me as an educator, maybe even more important is how to make other people aware of their responsibility to think and to learn how to choose. And that's something that my father, Rabbi Yochanan Zweig, has always instilled in his students, all of the alumni of the Yeshiva. As was mentioned, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary. The critical importance of using our brain to think and to choose correctly and well. And that's really where I'm coming from in terms of voting. And hopefully we'll discuss some issues in detail and try to kind of parse how should we think about things, how does the Torah shed light on how to think about things, and hopefully we can all become much more engaged in this process of thinking and choosing in our professional, communal life and also in our personal lives.
Thank you for setting that table, Rabbi. I really appreciate it. I thought the way we would do this is would give each of the panelists, let's say 3 to 4 minutes, to just give us their opening thoughts and ideas about voting in election, being Jewish in elections, and how to engage with the world in that way. So if we could start with Malcolm.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for convening this. The letter that you cited from Moshe Feinstein was actually written to me almost 50 years ago when I went to him and to the other Gedolim, to Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal and to the Debretziner Rav, to ask them for support in doing the first Jewish voter registration drive. So this is not a new problem. It's an old problem that we visit every 4 years at the very least. And there had been a tendency, contrary to the general impression that Jews vote in disproportionate number, younger Jews even then, and this is more than 35 years ago, more than 40 years ago, were voting like the general American population, which means half of them didn't vote, half were not registered. And we were able to register over 100,000 people in less than 2 months at a very minor cost, because people began to come to terms with the importance of voting, the role that we play. We observe Dina de Malchusa, we respect the laws of the lands in which we live. And one of the things that democracy demands of us is involvement. You have a choice to opt out, but then you can't complain about the consequences and the results. Our obligation, especially as Jews, because we care about the societies in which we live, we care about the world in which we live, plus we have special interests that we be involved. And that means at every level, running for office, working in congressional offices and campaigns, so that we have a say, because we have this obligation to each other and to future generations. This is one of the most consequential elections, certainly in my lifetime and perhaps in everyone's lifetime, because there's much more at stake. There are values at stake, fundamental values, the direction for our country. And at a time when the Jewish community is under particular stress with the events since October 7th, highlighting the dangerous and precarious position that Israel is in, that has become all the more so as we await Iran's next attack in Iraq and the 7-front war and all that Israel has confronted and continues to confront at this time, plus the war against anti-Semitism and the assault that Jews around the world are under, including in the United States, and judging the reaction and the responses of both parties and the candidates as part of our evaluation of who we should vote for, not whether we should vote, and that we look at this tendency towards isolationism, which is a very dangerous thing for us, and especially because of the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I hope we will have an opportunity to discuss all of those things. We have a lot at stake. Everybody's focused on the presidential elections. We have congressional elections. We have things that will shape the future of America in so many ways, including Supreme Court, including other appointments, at a very critical stage. When you see the world lined up at the United Nations against us, who represents the United States? Who sets the policy? Who sets the tone? How strong will they stand up for us in that awful body? Is just one manifestation of many of the importance of the outcome and the direction that our country will take. And that is often shaped by an election like this. So it is, I think for all of us as Americans, it's a responsibility, but I think especially for Jews, and especially at this time, and in the wake of what I call the October 8th revolution, of many young Jews coming back to the community, many people who were alienated from the community, who are coming back, people who had literally no contact for the first 60 years of their lives or more, are now doing only Jewish, and also looking for the guidance in terms of the political involvements in which they're engaged. Very different values than they may have had before October 7th. So it's a consequential time. It's a consequential election. And each of us has to think about our obligation to future generations as we evaluate what we do.
Thank you, Malcolm. That's incredible. I did not know that it was a letter to you. That's unbelievable. I literally sent it to the rabbi, a couple hours ago. I said, this is a great letter. My plan was to read it at the end. So I guess, I don't know, maybe you should read it because it's a letter to you.
Oh,
So
it's okay.
it's unbelievable. David, if you wanted to give us your opening thoughts about this election, about voting, about our relationship to voting as Jews.
Sure, and thank you for having me. We'll see if you appreciate having me after I'm done speaking. Because I actually represent a kind of a countercultural view, I think, on this call, in that I view myself as post-America, and I view that myself in that way for a few years now, all the more so in the last year, the last few months. And I think that we should be, when we look at statements of like Rabbeim, like Moshe Feinstein, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I think we have to look at them in the context that they were delivered. And they're not with us to respond to the current times. But I think America is in a very different place than it was when they made the statements they made. And I think that the world is a very different place. And most important, Israel is a very different place. I mean this in a very literal and practical way. I'm a messianist, and I believe that we're living in times of prophecy and times of the beginnings of redemption. And I think that we have to stop thinking about ourselves as American. We're Klal Yisrael, we have a state, we still live in Gullus, and we need to be concerned about the world around us. And as American citizens, we have an obligation to vote. I agree with that. And we have an obligation to vote in the interest of the country. I'm very hesitant to say, people who talk about voting in the interest of Israel against the interests of America, I don't think that's the right thing to do with our citizenship rights. But I think that, as we say that those who bless Israel are blessed and those who curse Israel are cursed, we should be voting in the interest of America supporting Israel for America's sake. But I think that post 10/7 and seeing the way the world has aligned against Israel, and yet Hashem has seen fit to perform miracles as he has always done in the wars we fought since Israel was formed. I'm hoping that more Jews will wake up to the reality that Israel is a force unto itself, and we're not a vassal state of America. And while we do want America to be successful in its own right, America is not a Jewish country. It is not the place for Jews to dictate the future of America. And I think that we should be looking at ourselves as American Jews, not Jewish Americans, and thinking about the future. When you talk about future generations, this is a time where we're making decisions now that will affect future generations. I just think we have to be thinking about in the context of Israel, not in America, because our future is in Israel. And I fear that the people who stay behind in America will be like, as the Midrash says, the 80% of Jews who stayed in Mitzrayim. That I think that those of us who choose to stay in America and remain Jewish Americans will have a worse outcome than those of us who choose to view ourselves as American Jews and eventually as Israeli Jews.
That's a really interesting perspective, and we definitely want to get more into that. Before we do that, though, I want to let Josh Hammer say his opening statement.
Okay, well, thank you guys very much for having me back. I really do appreciate it. I've known Ohad for a couple of years now, so always great to be involved here. So I have some rather strong disagreements with the perspective that we just heard from David, perhaps unsurprisingly. But I guess before getting into some of those disagreements, let me just outline kind of some very high-level thoughts on voting and civic engagement and whatnot there. So I'm a lawyer by training. I clerked for a federal judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. I still do a lot of law school lectures, including 4 in Illinois this past week, one of which I had a violent 30 SJP Hamasnik kafia-clad protest at, which required a police evacuation. That's really neither here nor there for present purposes. So I'm familiar with the post-October 7th rise of anti-Semitism, suffice to say, up close and personal. But all of that is to say that I come from a constitutionalist perspective. I'm born on Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Abraham Lincoln is my hero of all heroes in American history here. And I do come at this from the perspective of obviously a Jew. My wife happens to be Israeli born, raised here in the United States. Most of her family is in Israel. Her oldest brother, so my brother-in-law, lives in Netivot, so just about 5 miles or so from the Gaza border, a town that was miraculously spared from the October 7th massacre. But in any event, I have an extraordinarily close connection to Eretz Israel, even to the modern state of Israel. In fact, I have a forthcoming book, a shameless plug, due out in March, for which I just finished the manuscript, Baruch Hashem. The title of this book is Israel and Civilization, the Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. The title is slightly misleading unless you think of it as Kol Yisrael, because it's really about the Jews. But in any event, I have extraordinarily close connections to the state of Israel, but I'm also a devout American patriot, is really kind of the point that I wanted to make here. And to me, the beauty of being both an American and a Jew is that you don't have to choose. You actually can have it both ways. So, about a year and a half ago, down in Miami Beach, I debated Alan Dershowitz about what was then the pressing issue for much of Kol Yisrael, which was the Israeli judicial reform debate. After October 7th, that whole debate kind of seems like a total nothing burger, an afterthought at this point. But at the time, it was the big deal. And the debate was charged at times, and Alan and I have an on and off again relationship. But many years ago, Alan Dershowitz said something that still resonates, I think, very much with me today, which was the anti-Semites like to play this gotcha game. The people who accuse you of being a quote unquote Israel firster, they say, okay, let's play a hypothetical. Let's play a game here. If Israel and the United States go to war, who are you going to side with? And the beauty that Alan Dershowitz said is that the reason that he can, in intellectually honest fashion, refuse to answer that question is because it's just completely implausible. I mean, because American values are Israeli values. And going back all the way to the incredible philo-Semitism of the American founding, which I write about at great length actually in my upcoming book, it is simply not something that can possibly be contemplated. And it really is kind of that philo-Semitism going all the way back, even actually before the American founding. In fact, as part of the research that I did for this book, one fascinating thing that I found is, and some of you may be aware of this already, you could actually go back as far as 1620 and the sailing of the Mayflower and the people who were fleeing religious persecution in England and ultimately landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts. They conscientiously viewed themselves as the new Israelites. To them, the Atlantic Ocean was the Red Sea. And, at that time, actually, there was a lot of talk of possibly having Hebrew, not English, be the official language at that time in the American colonies. In fact, I'm going to even one up that. I was fascinated when I learned the following thing. The very first Thanksgiving to this day in the United States, the very first Thanksgiving, get a load of this. I couldn't believe this when I read this. We actually have good reason for thinking that the very first Thanksgiving, which ultimately came down from William Bradford and some of the other pilgrims, what they basically did was they land in Massachusetts. Thank God we've crossed the ocean successfully. They get on their knees and they bow down. We have reason for believing that what they were doing was essentially imitating Birkat HaGomel, because they'd actually just crossed a large body of water. In fact, William Bradford, who was on the Mayflower there, was actually a student of a great Christian Hebraist at that time who had written at length about Birkat HaGomel. So, with Thanksgiving coming up here on the American calendar in a few weeks, it's probably worth reminding that something as foundational to our civic culture actually has its roots in a somewhat abstruse Jewish bracha, actually. So I'm getting a little sidetracked here, but the point is that when it comes to voting, when it comes to thinking about where we stand in the year 2024, where the first president in American history, George Washington, famously in his beautiful letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, it was then the nation's largest Jewish community, only 25 families strong, but it was then the largest community. He famously said, "May the children of the stock of Abraham forever dwell securely in this land under their own vine and fig tree, and they shall never be afraid." John Adams famously said, this is a close paraphrase, that the Jews still being alive today, they are the mightiest nation that has ever lived. Everyone has gone away but for the Jews. He and Alexander Hamilton alike basically both viewed the Jews as essentially proof of God's existence, that the Jews are still here. Abraham Lincoln, my guy, the guy on whose birthday I was born, famously referred to America in February 1861 as a, quote, almost chosen people. I could go on and on here. Benjamin Franklin wanted the national seal of the United States to be Moshe Rabbeinu parting the Red Sea out of Mitzrayim. Jewish fabric is part of the American fabric. A lot of people say that America was founded on Judeo-Christian values. I have no objection to that term. Some of my best friends in the world are evangelical Christians, but I think it would be basically equally accurate to say that America was founded on Torah values, actually. That really, actually, frankly, is where it's coming from. That's why Leviticus, Vayikra, is quoted in the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. So what is our responsibility as Jews now in the year 2024, especially given post-October 7th changes that, again, I've experienced firsthand with some of these campus protests and whatnot there? I think the onus on us, the calling of the hour, our moral imperative, is to be active in the civic space and the public space as Jews, of course, but also as politically engaged Americans, and to go out to advocate for, to vote for, to support, and try to encourage our fellow Yids to get out there and to support the candidates who will continue, to the best of their ability, this fairly unbroken chain of tradition going all the way back to George Washington, arguably back to the Pilgrims even before him, when it comes to the inherent philo-Semitism of the American experiment.
Thank you for sharing that. Josh, we want to get into this conversation back and forth about voting and really how that plays out as Jews. Before we do that, though, Dr. Finkelstein is going to share with us really, really important information about voting and about how our day-to-day lives and the way we live actually impacts our belief in voting and how we engage with America as Jews and as members of the civic community.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks so much for having me on, Giddy, and thanks, Rabbi, for putting this together. Amazing panel. So by way of introduction, I'm Joel Finkelstein. I am the founder and the director of the Network Contagion Research Institute. Our organization performs high-profile research on a lot of threats facing different communities, and the research that we do tends to be pretty instrumental. We provided the empirical backbone of the research that supported the law that was passed by Congress and the Senate to force the sale or ban of TikTok from the country. We were able to feed information and crucial analyses to Congress to help pass bills to create greater transparency in how authoritarian funding in our university is predicting the growth of anti-Semitism. The work that we tend to do is it's on 60 Minutes, it's on the New York Times. It tends to be extraordinarily high profile, and it tends to be pretty hard hitting. So, I want to sort of take a step back from this conversation. I want to provide a research, a kind of angle to sort of what's happening to the American electorate, what's happening to our civic discourse, the role that Jews have in that. But I want to start by first really trying to have us understand and think seriously about what the Jewish dilemma is, and really what it's always been, right? That to some extent, when we think about what our collective history recalls, the events of Mitzrayim, eventually the realization that we had at Sinai. Sinai was really the birth of freedom. There's really, I think before that moment, one way to think about it is there was really no freedom to talk about. You could be a nice person, and you yourself could have the idea that you were a free person, but you were struck with a dilemma that the most you could be as that person in the world as it existed was a really nice guy in a really bad neighborhood. And so if you wanted to effect something that was a true project of freedom that could be sustained, I'm afraid you're going to need a posse. And what's more, you're going to need a shared covenant of mutual concern that's real, not just put on so people think better of you, but actual. With that construct that people could give themselves to a covenantal relationship that would bind them to each other, that would be sustained constitutionally inside a bordered country, came the idea that freedom actually had a real representative of the world, which was the first thing that authoritarians learned to hate. Okay, so that's our problem. Now that problem is playing out right here, because for everybody else, the challenge that you have if you don't have that in the marrow of your bones is that there's always a chance that you don't really mean the flowery language of freedom that you say you do, and then when that happens, your politics can become performative. And the goal of moral signification, moral grandstanding, and the worldwide wrestling federalization of politics becomes empty power sharing and making sure that other people comport to your ideology, because that's a safe way of making sure that your mob will win. And that's all that's left if you really don't believe we can talk to each other. Okay, so from the data standpoint, that appears to be what's happening to America. So two of the most prominent narratives that emerge in our civic discourse over the past few months as the election approached were some pretty wildly unreasonable ideas. One was that cats and pets are being eaten by immigrants across Springfield, Ohio. This was actually tweeted out by Elon Musk. It was mentioned by the president. It was actually invented by a bunch of Nazis in a Telegram channel. And it turns out that they used a lot of synthetic activity to boost this up before it became popular online, because they anticipated that it would be a ready-made way to capture people into an ideological vector of contention. How about the idea that this was fake or staged? This was also, it turns out, generated online, where our simulated lives are replacing the real ones. And it became a reality for a lot of people. Our recent work was featured in NBC. We had Yeshiva students here at the Talmud Academy of Miami actually help us out in Florida, actually help in the development of this. We need Yeshiva Bachers to do some of this thinking. And what we found was that with the Trump assassination story, we have almost 1,000 bot-like accounts. These are mostly humans really acting as bots. Okay, so it's real botification, right? That they put out millions of tweets, right, in a coordinated way to get that going. And the same was true with the Haitian pet story, right? That you had activist Nazis that were working together to generate this up. Now, the more bot-like these accounts were, the more likely they were to utter this mindless nonsense. And it turned out that people believed it, right? When we did polls of this in the American people, we found that close to 30% of people believe that Trump staged his own assassination. And close to 22% of people really believe that there's an epidemic of pet eating in Springfield, Ohio. Okay, so what's motivating that? Well, how about left and right-wing authoritarianism? That's the #1 predictor. So it turns out you have a bunch of bot people. The more bot-like they are, the more willing they are to say this. The more bot-like people are in terms of their authoritarian obedience on the left and the right, the more likely they are to believe it. And you know what else about those people? They don't believe they have any control in their lives. This is called internal locus of control. Okay, it's a quality that we attribute responsibility to ourselves. We think our choices matter. The less you believe that, the more likely you are to believe the other stuff. Okay, so you have bots who are able to force our choices into completely motivated beliefs that have no bearing on reality whatsoever, that become extremely widely entrenched in order to create a corridor of ideologies, of idols that nobody really believes is true, but no one thinks our moral commitments are serious anyway. Their idols are silver or gold. It's the work of human hands. The people that make them become them. Eyes they have, but they see not. Ears they have, but they hear not. Okay, so this is a very old problem that's being recycled here again. Our worship of cultural artifacts instead of serious conversation. It's not going to matter who wins this election. Not when we're looking at this. And by the way, those bots have one thing in common. In addition to disseminating all the rest of this, it seems they don't like Jews very much. What a coincidence. Well, the reason that's true is because we have a forced choice. It turns out we do believe it. It turns out that no matter how much they need us to be, we are not like them. That's a problem. Okay? So what we have to do is we must find ways to exhibit agency. We have to do that collectively. We have to actually be concerned about one another and our civic discourse in doing that, because the proof of the exercise of civic activity, especially by the people most threatened by its absence, is the only thing that's convincing to people who don't believe we have a future anyway. I'm afraid they're going to insist that we prove that they do. So I think that we need to have new ideas. We need to have new ways of working together. We need to act instrumentally. Okay, and that's the only thing that's going to convince us or anyone else that the structures of democracy can be utilized in order to protect the people that it's supposed to protect. And we aren't just victims in that conversation. We are actors. We are choosers. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Joel.
Thank you, Giddy, for doing that research. And Ohad as well. You guys did great work.
Our pleasure. Anytime. For those who don't know, Joel is our boss, which is one of the reasons I couldn't. He could talk for as long as he wants because he pays my paycheck. He signed that paycheck, so not much I can do to shut him down. So now, thank you for the opening statements, everyone. We're going to go into questions. I prepared questions for each one of our panelists to really hone in on their thinking about how we're supposed to engage with this election and with voting. And then we will get to questions from the audience. If people have questions, you can put it now in the chat. We'll read them, or you can raise your hand when we get to that point. Just a quick point on that. We're not going to be having, from the audience, any sort of politicking. No one's going to be endorsing or campaigning for their preferred candidate. That's not the space for this. So OHAD is going to be keeping a very, very close eye on that. It's questions about clarifying your own thinking and understanding where we are as Jews in this election cycle and how we can make the best decisions for ourselves. So with that, I'm going to go to Malcolm. First of all, if you want to just reflect on anything that any of the other panelists have said, you're always welcome for that. But I have a specific question, which is something that was brought up by the other panelists and yourself as well, and I think is on the forefront of all of our minds, is Israel, right? I mean, I think it's due now, especially post-October 7th. Israel is really on our mind all day, at least 3 times a day, if not more. How do we as Americans, American Jews, Jewish Americans, how do we balance our commitment to Israel? Maybe you'll say there is no balance, but how do we balance our commitment to Israel? And how do we look at the trade-offs that we might have to make in supporting one party over the other if we think one might be better for Israel, but one might be better for America? How do we engage with those tensions in our own thinking about the election and about voting?
So it's actually a question that requires a far greater explication than this would allow, but I'll try to hit some of the vital points on this, and it would touch on some of the comments made before. I also do not believe there's a conflict with being committed to Israel. I also am building a place in Israel. I spend a lot of time there, and yet I live in America. I have children who will be in both places eventually, but we cannot start off with the assumption that there's a conflict between the two, because that becomes then a totally different discussion. I do think it's vital about how Jews talk to each other and how we work as a community, which is what gives us our strength. It is in our unity. And even where there is diversity, we have never said we're a homogeneous community. We have said that we can unite on basic principles, which gives us political clout, because when you can come as a community and say this is the interest, unfortunately we have voices that differ and often work contrary to the vital interests of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. And it's our job to speak against those voices. But we have a multiplicity of challenges right now. We have a country that is heading towards isolationism. I think it's more reminiscent of the 40s in many respects. We see the coalescence of forces against vital American interests, in which Israel is a core issue. The fact that you had the BRICS conference last week, you see Russia, China, Iran, North Korea working together, expanding their efforts. China, the Shanghai Cooperation Council, becoming more and more influential. You see the basic shifts in the plates of that will have very broad consequences in the Belt and Road in China and its more aggressive behavior. And the answer to that cannot be an isolationist America, an America that withdraws onto itself and looks only at its domestic problems, as important as it is for them to do it. The United States is still the leader. It is still the most important country, and what it does matters. We see what it doesn't do matters as well, and especially when it comes to something like Iran or support for our allies, and even the hint of messages that we sent can have broad consequences for the things that we care about. So an election is not merely about the individual; it's about the direction the country is likely to take, though there's no guarantees, and to think about what we want to see the day after to look like. I am worried about the day after. I'm worried about reactions in this country. I'm worried about potential for violence. I'm worried about all of those things. That's a separate discussion I think that we can have. I am primarily focused right now on anti-Semitism, on Iran, on Israel's war, on the Seventh Front War against Israel, and how we work together to make sure that Israel has what it needs. which means also the election of members of Congress is very important. It's not just at top of the ticket, it's going down the whole line, even to the level of local officials. The Arabs are doing a great job, and I warned about this 15 and 20 years ago already, because we saw the first signs of it, that they were electing committeemen and city council people because they move up the chain, and all of a sudden you have an AOC or people, though not necessarily Arab themselves, but who reflect those point of views, because we didn't take the action. She won with 10% of the vote. And it's true of many others who are fighting us, won because the community didn't act, the community didn't mobilize, the community didn't turn out. They're turning out this year. And I think that there is an awakening, partially because of October 7th, but for many other reasons as well, because I think people have come to understand what the stakes are. And when we see the demonstrations on our campuses and the work that NCRI has done is amazing in exposing the foreign influence, the role of China, the role of Qatar, the role of Russia and Iran and others in influencing young people, particularly the K-12, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about as well, and how critically important it is. The Catholic Church says, give me a kid till he's 6, you can have him the rest of their lives. We are seeing kids in kindergartens across the United States being poisoned against Israel and against Jews. And you cannot draw a distinction between the two. They mean all of us. They make no distinction. And therefore, I don't find a conflict with standing up for Israel on all of its issues. I think the stronger Israel is, the stronger America is. You see it in the reaction of all the Arab countries, that when America doesn't stand up for Israel, they lose confidence in America. They move away from America. But when America stands up for it and works, you get an Abraham Accord. You get other measures that are adopted. So right now we are in a very critical moment, I think, on all of these issues, and it's going to take a really resolute and united community to help educate others. We have many allies amongst the American people. I've worked with Christian evangelicals for 30 years. They are great allies. Unfortunately, younger generations, it's weaker, but we can do a lot there. We have other potential communities, the Hindu communities, Asian Americans, many others who are potential allies. But we have to make the investment, and we have to look at it as how we build a stronger society here, how we protect our investments. We can look at Israel, and I'm president of the Great Synagogue. I'm president of 4 or 5 different initiatives in Israel, so I don't have to be convinced. But I'm also convinced that we have billions and billions of dollars of investments here that we can't walk away from, that we have to protect our communities, and that means getting elected officials who will stand by us. So we have many agendas right now. The tendency towards of Americans today not to want to see America involved, not to want to invest, that candidates can say, we're not going to give any more money to Israel, we're not going to give money to Ukraine, we're not going to fight and stand up against the enemies. That's the end of America. That's the destruction of the fundamental values that we're supposed to represent. And so I think it's a time when we have to look at candidates who are going to stand up, evaluate them, learn about them. Don't just go by headlines. Look at the facts of what America has done. And in the case of Israel, sending the THAAD, sending the B-52s, and at the same time not supplying the critical weapons that they need. These are things that an educated constituency has to evaluate so that you can advocate intelligently to elected officials and to bring them around, as NCRI's work did help us with members of Congress who were skeptical, I can tell you. And I worked with a group to bring university students from 20 colleges. The congressmen were crying at the end. They said, we didn't know this. We couldn't believe it. They couldn't even comprehend when students told how their dorm doors were set on fire on Friday at Drexel, or being beaten up at Penn, or at other universities across the country. So the stakes are so high right now. And that's why we need a unified community to say, these are fundamental values. It doesn't matter if you have an R, a D, an I, whatever initial there, understand what is the goals that we should have in common and how do we achieve them.
Thank you for that. So I was going to go to David next. I see you raised your hand, but I was going to go to you next because I know that education has become a massive point of interest for you, especially recently. For those who don't know, recently David pulled a very large amount from University of Pennsylvania, his alma mater, and has committed to reinvesting that in Israel. So I wanted to go to David there, and besides for talking about education, if you could talk about education, higher education, but if you could talk about education throughout the life cycle of a person, and how we can better engage with the world in that. And additionally, if you have a couple minutes as well, talk about how your thinking is on balancing different priorities and different values when it comes to voting. When you get in that voting booth, because I know for me, when I get in the voting booth, I'm always sitting there like, oh, I could vote for that party, and there's a lot of values that I get from Judaism and Torah that can lead me in all sorts of different directions. So if you could talk about that, that would be greatly appreciated.
Sure. I mean, I think just to frame the conversation, we're living in 1984. And I don't mean that facetiously or extremely. I mean, the work against TikTok, the work that I did early on back in the late 1910s on Facebook, we're living in 1984. We have, in 1984, there was a screen on the wall that told people what to think, that up was down and black was white. And we're living in a world where, Haitians are eating cats, and, major filmed events that have like thousands and thousands of live people at it are staged and faked and don't really happen. And as Joel pointed out, the research shows people believe it. That filters down to education. And what we learned in the last year at major universities around America, and actually the Congress just released a report which documented the extent to the systemic nature of the anti-Semitism on campuses, that faculty members, administrators, leaders of universities, board members, and students are working to a degree against Jews in a systematic way. And they're doing it as a part of the education. The core curriculum at these schools are infected by corrupt ideas that are teaching us to malign the founding fathers, to malign the founders of America, to malign Western thought. And as Joel, NCRI has pointed out, that a lot of this research is funded and the faculty members are installed using money from the enemies of the West, from Iran, from Qatar, from China, from Russia. And it's been going on for decades. So, my stance when it comes to American universities is that we've lost, that we can't, all the major donors, the Jewish donors and schools are saying, fire this president, replace this board member, change your policies on campus. That's putting a Band-Aid on on an open, arterial wound. Like, we're not going to solve these problems by trying to Band-Aid over what's happened to these schools. We need to find alternatives to educate our children. My son was a student at Penn. He's now transferred to Yeshiva University. My daughter has been accepted to Brandeis. She's going to go to school in Israel. I think that we should be thoughtful. We can't be looking historically. Yes, America has been amazing for us. Yes, America was founded on by God-fearing people, on ideas based in Torah and the New Testament and Christianity and Judaism. But that's the past. The present, we're living in a time where half the country is godless. And godless is a value, not godless in some negative way, but actually godless by saying that we should not be allowing God to influence. God doesn't exist as far as we're concerned, and we should be living our lives as though we're just people, coming up with moral relativism, coming up with ideas of what we think is good and bad. And if you think something's good, that has validity, whether it's cannibalism or witchcraft or whatever. And we, on the other hand, there are God-fearing people in America that are trying to, maintain the founding fathers' principles. But there's a war going on in America. And, Malcolm alluded to the risk of violence as a result of this election. I think that's a very real fear. And I really think that we're living in a post-democracy time because of social media, because of Citizens United, because money buys influence on platforms, and people, because of 1984, people live their lives based on what they read on Facebook, what they see on TikTok. And the algorithms are pushing ideas on people that are influencing the way they think. So yes, I think we shouldn't just give up. We should fight the good fight. We should try to steer our children to getting better educations. We should try to combat the anti-Semitism going on in the elementary school and high school system. But we should also recognize that the forces against us are entrenched. And we shouldn't fight a losing war. If we have knives, we can't take knives to an Uzi fight. And I think that while we are doing the best we can fighting the social media battles, we don't own TikTok. We don't control Facebook. We don't have the ability to affect the profit motive of the founders of these social media companies. And so they're not trying to do good. They're just trying to make money. China's trying to influence the world by selling cars at a discount to influence, to get information about where people are, and selling access to social media. Their large language model is the sixth largest one in the world, and it teaches people that China is a democracy, America is questionable, and Korea is the bastion of freedom. So the idea that it's a nice idea that America was founded on these values and we're always aligned, but it doesn't represent the reality of today. The last year has shown us that there are strong forces in America that are looking to sever ties with Israel, to become an enemy of Israel. And if we think back to the glory days, the golden era of Jewish life in America, and view that as the persistent truth, I think we're going to really hurt ourselves. So I think that the American election is like, I think, the tertiary problem of today for Jews. I think the primary problem for Jews today is the war going on in Israel. We're not doing enough to support Israel and to help defend Israel by fighting anti-Semitism in America and spending money here. We're depriving Israel of resources they need. And I think the secondary issue is building up the infrastructure of Israel to make it a stronger, more independent nation for itself, helping it build up its supply chain, its ability to create weapons for itself, to fight for itself, building up its university systems, all the billionaires in America that are still giving money to American universities. If they gave 10% of what they gave to American universities to Israeli universities, there would be a golden age of education in Israel. But we need to be, and this is where I think this mentality that we are Jewish Americans, and talking about the glory days of how America is this bastion of freedom for Jews, I just think that's something that's a thing of the past, a long past. I think the last year has shown us how entrenched the change is. And I think that we should be thinking about changing our behavior prospectively, looking at things from first principles. Don't be influenced by our idealization of the past, but really look at the facts on the ground, what's been revealed in the last year, what we can extrapolate back from the last few decades based on what's been going on in university campuses and in the education system, and think about whether or not Israel can thrive with Americans devoting so much of its resources, American Jews devoting so much of its resources to life in America, as opposed to focusing it on building up life in Israel.
Thank you for that, David. That was really insightful. And I wanted to go to Josh next. I have a question, although I think you might just reflect back on what everyone else has said, but I'll ask the question anyways. It feels like in America, there has been a repolarization, a realignment of the political parties to some degree. You see people who in the past, even 2-4 years ago, would have been on separate sides of the aisle, have now joined forces, whether it's people who are now endorsing Democrats or people who are Democrats now endorsing Republicans. It feels like a very confusing time to be a person engaging in American politics, I guess, which is the theme in all of these questions. Can you give us an idea, as well as your thinking on how you balance priorities and values when voting? Can you give us an idea of how someone might begin to understand the battleground of today's America, if you want to? If not, just go ahead and reflect back what other people have said. But if that was my question.
Okay, sure. So look, I think in David's first response, there was a lot that I instinctually disagreed with. I probably disagree less with what he just said now. I mean, look, I am very sober. I am a realist. I obviously recognize that the America of the year 2024 is not the America of 1787 at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, or when Lincoln gave his almost chosen people speech in Trenton, New Jersey in 1861. Again, I have personally felt this numerous times. I was forcibly shouted down for 35 to 40 minutes by a pro-Hamas mob at the University of Michigan last November. I just briefly alluded to earlier what happened to me at Loyola University Chicago School of Law this past Wednesday. So I have seen it. I have seen it with my own eyes. I have seen the look in the eyes of people wearing the keffiyehs who are thinking and acting as if they want to do me very bad physical harm. So yes, and that has very tangible ramifications for when it comes to what kind of public policies and political philosophy and political ideology can try to be a little more muscular, perhaps, and a little less a little less passive when it comes to trying to unwind some of these very pernicious forces that have happened here. I have lots of thoughts, for instance, when it comes to immigration policy. Essentially, I am a vociferous foe of mass large-scale immigration, especially from foreign hostile cultures that simply do not assimilate and have not assimilated into the American fabric. I think that is a very large reason for a lot of the woes that we are currently seeing in America today. I have lots of other thoughts on other issues as well, but I guess unless we are assuming that every Jew ought to just pick up wherever he or she is around the world and just move to Israel, then we have to soberly recognize that America has a very large Jewish population, and that historically this country has been quite hospitable to the Jews. And I think that it is a very reasonable thing for us to kind of try to engage as both Americans and Jews. Although I would agree with David's formulation that I do think of myself as an American Jew and not a Jewish American. I definitely very much do agree with that. And I think that any God-fearing Jew, for instance, ought to think of him or herself that way as well. I at least that is my opinion. I would be a little surprised, frankly, if it were the other way around. Now we are at, and kind of segueing to your question, Giddy, a little bit. We are at a very interesting time in American politics where we're now 9.5 years almost in the aftermath of the gilded escalator descent that kind of changed the American political landscape. And we're very much in the midst of what most political commentators, left, right, center, and everywhere in between refer to as some sort of realignment happening between the parties. And there is kind of just a general kind of more populist, for lack of a better term, sentiment out there now. And I do think that it is important for Jews to grasp that, no doubt about that. And again, this is another point that I probably am in agreement with when it comes to what David said, is that it does no one any good to pretend like we are in the halcyon days of the golden age of American Jewish life, the 60s, 70s, back when people, knew many Holocaust survivors, or knew many whose family died in the Shoah, back when kind of America's kind of collective communitarian guilt, as well as kind of the guilt of the Western world, was what was still there in a way that manifested itself in a more meritocracy-based social system that allowed Jewish Americans to thrive. We obviously are pretty far past that at this particular point. So for instance, one of the ways, I'll just give one very concrete example. I'll talk about foreign policy just a little bit here. One of the ways that I personally think about foreign policy, we hear a lot of talk, for instance, of how America is turning in a more isolationist direction. I personally have always rejected a lot of these labels when it comes to American foreign policy, when it comes to quote unquote isolationism, when it comes to quote unquote interventionism or neoconservatism, whatever you want to call it there. I actually have a whole lengthy chapter on my book on this. To me, the logical way, and just interrupt me if I'm going too far off track here, but one logical way, especially in this more kind of populist moment, that I would encourage American Jews, Zionists, supporters of close U.S.-Israel relations, and so forth there to think and to talk about foreign policy would be to not necessarily do so towards kind of a World War II era truth, justice, and the American way, we're going to spread freedom everywhere sort of mentality. I think that rightly is viewed as somewhat outmoded and outdated by many younger Americans, especially non-Jewish younger Americans. Rather, I think a better way to think about foreign policy, especially when it comes to U.S.-Israel relations, is through the lens of the American national interest. To me, a sober, prudential, national interest-centric foreign policy is actually the best possible way to try to sell U.S.-Israel relations to even a possibly skeptical audience out there. In fact, I would argue there that was actually the very mentality that led to the Abraham Accords peace deals in the first place, going back to the year 2020, was that you wouldn't have gotten those deals unless the United States and Israel had convinced, for instance, some of these Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, that it was in their concrete national interest. Forget about morals. I mean, who cares, for instance, if we all share the exact same approach when it comes to X, Y, Z things there. I mean, does the fact that the UAE or Bahrain or even Saudi Arabia has a slightly different approach when it comes to public executions or something like that, is that really going to prohibit me from trying to make common cause when it comes to our mutual threat vis-a-vis the Iranian regime? No, of course not, right? So, I mean, common shared morality is important when it comes to foreign policy, but it is not the be-all, end-all. And on the contrary, I think that getting out ahead of our skis when it comes to trying to export our version of morality has actually done a lot of harm, especially when it comes to things like the failed intervention in Libya in 2011, toppling Muammar Gaddafi. Here we are 13 years later. It's really just a jihadist cesspool. I could talk about Iraq if need truly be. There's a lot of examples there, but I think a sober national interest foreign policy is just one concrete example of some sort of public policy that would really behoove more American Jews to try to sell as benefiting the United States and Israel from a U.S.-Israel perspective in a way that is politically palatable to a younger generation that has grown up in the aftermath of various failed foreign policy boondoggles overseas as well. So that's just one example, Giddy, as to what a public policy argument that I think is more fitting for our times might look like.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So I wanted to go now to, before we, being very aware of the time and how everyone here is incredibly busy. It feels like every minute I keep the people on this call, it feels like people are not manning the battle stations. So I'm very, very aware of the time. I wanted to go quickly to Dr. Joel to talk about, because it feels like there's a overarching message of confusion and paralysis, populism, and civic decay from all of our panelists today. And I wanted to go to Dr. Joel to see if there's any research on how can we combat that? How do we is there a way in which we can begin to fight back against this delay and paralysis and even some populism?
Well, I'm going to start with a couple things. First of all, I basically agree with David's cynicism. I mean, I basically think that if we're not having the conversation about what's really going on, warts and all, then we're not doing ourselves or anyone else service or justice. And we have to see that. Now, I do see that. I come to a little bit of a different place than David does, but I think we have to start off with tachlis. What's like, how bad is this and how bad can it get? And let's be real about that. So I think that when we're thinking about like what happened, like I'll flip to this time I left Rabbi Akiva. Like you look at what happened in a place like Shushan, where like these guys in Shushan and people like Achashverosh, these are guys who would literally dance on their own graves if the food that they were offering the buffet was good enough. Okay, that's how not home those people were, and because of how corrupt and licentious and how much money there was there, it turned out that fools like Achashverosh could turn to people they don't fully understand. And those people take advantage in order to sow all kinds of problems, genocidal ideologies. They're not from around there. He was an immigrant after all, and just like we were, right? And so Haman is a guy who is completely unaligned. He ends up getting involved in all these institutions and taking them over essentially. And he's got some really, really, really bad ideas. Okay, so that's what's happened here. Our 501c3 system is getting hundreds of millions of dollars from China, right? And people are getting tax breaks so that they can shut down our bridges and our air. People across universities everywhere. They're getting a nice tax break for that. And that's not just our 501c3 system, it's also our universities. And by the way, it's our public schools. Okay, so in research that we've come out with just last week, this was in the New York Post, two of the teachers I believe are here in the audience. They're leading a flock of over 2,000 teachers in New York that are working together with us. We're developing a crowdsourced intelligence apparatus in order to image what's happening in these schools. I'm not kidding. I wish I were making this up. Organizations that are laundering money for foreign terrorist organizations, as designated by U.S. agencies. These 501c3s are providing curriculum in our public schools. These are the same 501c3s that are training Intifada children's camps in Gaza to provoke terror. while they're funneling money to terror organizations, and they're in charge of Middle Eastern education. And it's not just a few schools. These are recommended resources by the Department of Education itself, and they're in 25% of public schools across the United States. How did we let this happen? Okay, so it is that bad. Here's the difference, David. I think we can win. Okay, so the reason I think we can win is that when Mordechai came to Achashverosh, his pitch was very simple. These Nazis, you don't want them around. I'm quoting Rabbi Zweig here. He knows this. He says, these Nazis, you don't want them around. Leave them to us. Let us handle them for you. We will take care of this. Okay? Working with these teachers, we created a crowdsourced intelligence apparatus that was able to use AI to take thousands of documents from these classrooms, including the curriculum. We're able to use large language models to assess just how bad the bias was. We're able to create all of the incidents that had occurred. We were able to map how they were related to the funding organizations that were creating this system. And by pulling that together, we were able to demonstrate how we can work together to actually unearth these problems and solve them. And when we do, we don't just solve them for ourselves. We're pushing on those instruments. We're showing what civic agency can do because we have no other choice. So we have to choose to do this. We have to choose to exhibit the agency to go into these fights in new ways. And we can do it. No wonder they're coming for us. They're right to come for us. There is something we can do about this.
But Joel, it's game theory. They're not a stagnant enemy. You know, 8 years ago, I fought against Facebook, and I managed to shave a quarter of $1 trillion off their market share with a $500,000 investment by fighting them with their own methodology. Created a hashtag to delete Facebook, created an ad campaign. Within 6 months after the campaign, they were worth more than when I started. The enemy is not stagnant, and we're using our resources. Your brilliant resources are going towards creating things that are going to be counter-programmed trivially once they see what you're doing. And so I think that it's a noble effort, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I just think the difference between now and the time of Achashverosh is that we have Eretz Yisrael, we have Medinat Yisrael, we have the IDF, and I think that if Mordechai and Esther could have been airlifted out of Shushan by the IDF and brought to Eretz Yisrael, I think that would have been a better outcome.
I find this comical coming from the guy who, by the way, is one of our biggest supporters, who just literally helped get TikTok kicked out of the country. Yeah, we're really falling apart here, Dave.
No, I think we should have to fight the good fight. I think we have to just, like you said, cynicism. We have to be realistic about the enemy we have and the resources we have. We have Israel, we have the greatest army in the world, and we have Hashem performing miracles for us. And I think that we should not discount our strengths. We're not living in a post-Holocaust environment where we have America and nothing else. We have a lot more now. We have the greatest army in the world backed by Hashem. And, you know, as much as we like to have the arms from America, I think that, you know, Hashem will provide if America decides to turn on us. I just think that we need to be looking at things in an order. And while I think these fights we're doing in America are tertiary battles, I think we need to make sure we devote enough resources, intellectual and financial, to fighting the more important battles, which is fighting against our enemies in Israel and building up the infrastructure of Israel.
Thank you for that, Joel and David. I heard the word miracle and God a bunch of times, and Hashem, so I think that sounds like a bat signal for the rabbi. So I don't know if the rabbi wants to jump in and maybe say a couple thoughts on the discussion there.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, such an enlightening conversation. I don't feel like I want to go. I know other people probably need to go. I'm so excited to hear from everybody more. Josh, Malcolm, everyone. And basically what I want to point out is this. The greatest sages throughout the ages have cautioned us against predicting when Mashiach is arriving. We have been kicked out from Eretz Yisrael plenty of times. God forbid that could happen again, which is what October 7th began to feel like. We've seen a miraculous recovery over this last 6-8 weeks. But the reality is that what we need to fix is the Jewish people. It's not about if America is going to be safe, if Israel is going to be safe, if it's the IDF, if America is going to regain American values. It's about what do we need to do as Jewish people. And I feel very, very strongly about this. I think I share Malcolm's passion for this particular point. We love our Jewish people in Israel, and we love our Jewish people outside of Israel. And we have to do whatever we can to help the Jews across the world. And I don't disagree with David at all that we need to pick our battles and try to prioritize 100%, but the Jewish people are our priority. And I think if the leaders of America in the Jewish world packed up and went to Israel, I don't think that's what God wants. Now, that doesn't mean I necessarily think that we can save America, but we have choices in front of us. The work that David, you are doing with Dr. Finkelstein is amazing. Are you right that it can all be trivialized in a moment? Maybe, but you know what? Only Hashem knows. Did anybody know that the exploding beepers and pagers was going to happen? I mean, that's ridiculous. God is not only working through the IDF, God is working through all of his Jewish people in the world. And so I feel very, very, very strongly that the value, which is why I began the conversation with nothing better than good Jews getting together to discuss what should the Jewish people do. I think that's one of the most important values that we really need to do much better at, which is I can't thank all of you enough for joining, especially our panelists, hopefully to inspire more of these collaborative efforts, because that can really change the world, because that will change the Jewish people. And that's what we need to do first and foremost. That's what every single one of our prophecies tell us. And if you look at Nachmanides in last week's parsha, he predicted a Mashiach outcome that didn't happen, and the Chassam Sofer corrected it to his era, and that didn't happen. Nobody knows when that's happening, as Maimonides says. So great, I'm a Messianist too. I just have no idea when, which is what the principle requires us to say. We have no idea when. It could be now. Great. But in terms of picking our priorities, I don't have the millions to go around and say, well, is it this million here or this million there? I do have, education as what I think is the key weapon that, from what I understand, David, you're also a big believer in. And there is so much more that we can do in terms of education in this country that can help Jews in this country, that can also help this country, and that can also help the Jews in Israel.
Thank you, Rabbi. So I guess the way we'll do this is give Malcolm a chance to reflect, and then we'll go. I know we have at least one public question, and then we'll give each panelist a chance to give closing thoughts, and we can all go and vote. Does that sound good to everyone? All right, Malcolm, if you have anything to say, I'm sure you do. Wise words.
There's so much to be said about the conversation that we've had. I think we have a lot of loose threads that really should be brought together. But the most immediate thing is that people should go out and vote, get their children to vote, make sure others go out to vote. That's the most immediate challenge. We have 2 more days to try and make a difference. I think that we have to look at this long term about educating this generation within the Jewish community, attendant to the Jewish community, about the importance of involvement. That the one thing democracy demands of people is to be involved. If you opt out, you have no right to complain about the results. And I think right now, we cannot have people opting out, not in regard to Israel, not in regard to anti-Semitism, not in regard to this, because our future, our children's future, this is really a battle about generations. When Avram Avinu was blessed, he said, that it's not just about you, it's about your children and your children's children and future generations. So I agree fully with David. The difference from the 30s, not from Achashverosh, where I think the situation was different, but the difference from the 30s, and I always rejected comparisons to the Holocaust because I think it was a unique event in history. But I don't reject any more comparisons to 1935. The difference today is that we have in Israel, with an Israeli army, an Israeli Air Force, that the Jews of Russia, of Ethiopia, of Yemen, of Syria, of Iraq, Iran, we've been able to save them all because we have a Jewish state, because we have learned the lesson of that never again means each of us has a responsibility to stand up, to speak out, to act, not to find excuses and not to find ways around it and to get into philosophical debates which yield very little. We need to recognize the tachlis of this moment, and that is we have We need the United States to be an ally of Israel. We need the United States. You can demean its role or whatever. That's not reality. There's only one ally that can matter to Israel right now, and there's only one alliance, and that's Israel's importance to America and America's importance to Israel, as showing why the war on anti-Semitism is a war for the U.S., that the efforts of China sponsoring the demonstrations on campuses is to undermine the United States. So they don't give a damn about Gaza, and they don't care about the Jews. They care about undermining the United States. You know, Disraeli once said, there's no fate more ghastly than a stupid Jew. He didn't mean our IQs. He meant Jews who don't get it, Jews who don't understand the world as it is, not as we would like it to be.
Right.
And that really is the critical challenge at this moment. We have to educate this generation. We have to get them involved. We have unique opportunities that tens of thousands of young people want to return to the community, tens of thousands of well-known businessmen, when Bill Ackman or many others follow the example of Mr. Magerman and cut their contributions and say, now I'm giving Jewishly. We have to take advantage, and we need all our resources, everybody, to be involved in this, to take advantage of this moment. That will change the world.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. So we're going to go now to a member of the audience, and a very, very important member of the audience to us, a brand new collaborator of ours, Zach Dahlberg, who is finishing his PhD, God willing, in less than a month in neuroscience. So we're all very proud of him. And he has a question. I believe I saw him raise his hand. So if not, we can unmute you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Giddy. Yeah, it just relates to whether we've won or lost this war in America. So towards David mostly. You know, from my understanding, Jewish safety in America has always been predicated on liberal democracy. So equality under the law, the enshrinement of minority rights. And I don't feel like we've lost that war yet. We may have lost the war in certain institutions, but we've rebuilt institutions before, like Brandeis University, Mount Sinai hospitals. But the fight against liberal democracy, I don't think we've lost.
I mean, we have. I think that, you know, and I think it started with Citizens United. It started with the super PACs and the power of AI and social media. I think we believe we have democracy because we think we have free will. But, you know, I've seen people making the most irrational decisions based on the intellectual bubbles they travel in on their social media, and that warps democracy to be, you know, ineffective. And I also don't understand the infatuation with democracy. It's a relatively new phenomenon. It's not Torah based. I think, you know, the divinely anointed kingship is the ideal government for Israel and the Jews. In the absence of that, you know, the having self-governance, the Sanhedrin, rabbinic authority, living our lives by Torah for Jews is the right way. I think that democracy is a modern construct of, you know, kind of a kind of godless society that had this belief that humanity could come up with constructs on its own. I think it's been an interesting experiment, but we've seen that when you create something that's, you know, human made and fragile, it ends up getting weaponized by enemies of whatever the power structure is to undermine it. We're seeing China and Iran and Russia, you know, manipulating democracy to our detriment. So I just think we have to like look at the what is actually democracy. You know, one man, one vote. The idea that we actually can determine what happens based on, you know, voting on things, and look at who we're voting for. Look at who both parties have put up, not just at the top of the ticket, but down the line. I mean, I can't say that we're putting up the best and the brightest. And I think that's a product of social media. It's a product of AI. It's a product of the effective efforts of our enemies to dismantle democracy. Good people don't run for office anymore. You know, selfless people don't seek power. And I think that is the cornerstone. You know, the fact that George Washington stepped down from the presidency is one of the defining moments of American democracy. And now we have, you know, leaders fighting to stay in power beyond their ability to actually do any good for us. So I think that we just need to like examine, you know, our preconceptions like about the idealization of democracy, the reality of today, looking through the prism of post 10/7 reality and what's going on in Israel and what's going on our campuses, and just try to be more, I think, clear-eyed about what the reality is today.
Thank you for that. I don't know if anyone else wants to
Yeah,
respond.
Giddy, can I just say a couple words?
Go for it.
So, a lot of very interesting stuff here. So, I agree that democracy is a relatively recent phenomenon. Recent-ish. I mean, technically, it goes back to demos, the Greek word, the ancient Greeks, all of that, Athens and whatnot. But it's definitely not from the Bible. I mean, I totally agree with David. If I were living in Eretz Israel personally, my preferred form of government would be a monarchy led by a monarch from the Davidic line, and live in a halakhic state. If I were to live in Eretz Israel, that would be my preferred form of government. But we do live in America now. One thing that I think is a totally an erroneous misconception out there is that so-called liberal democracy is the only form of democracy. Liberalism and democracy are not the same thing. They're actually operating on different planes. Liberalism is a fairly modern political ideology, much more modern than democracy itself. Liberalism you can really trace to John Locke and the European Enlightenment and the 17th century and whatnot. It is a claim about humans, governments, God, and rights and duties, and that which we owe, that which we have ordained, whatnot. There, democracy is essentially a theory that the people decide their own electoral outcomes and therefore their own destiny. But there is an alternative way to view this. My friend and Edmund Burke Foundation colleague Yoram Hazony, himself a Jew living in Eretz Israel, has a great essay for First Things Magazine in January 2019 that I would encourage you to look at. The title of that essay is Conservative Democracy, putting a slightly different approach to what democracy in the Anglo-American tradition ought to look like. In my opinion, the founding generation from the late 1700s here in America was not a quote-unquote liberal democracy, the likes of which we think of it today, but something more closely along the lines of what Yoram would refer to as a conservative democracy. Just one final, just real quick comment on this. I don't share this this notion that the 2010 Citizens United case is disproportionately responsible for a lot of our woes. I think that's a little out there, to be honest with you. There are some things that are a deeply pernicious threat when it comes to democracy, be it conservative or liberal. For example, I would submit that the modern woke ideology is actually an existential threat to democracy, whether you think of it as liberal or conservative democracy. So there are a lot of things out there that I think are existential threats. But Zach, to get back to your question, you're right that none of them have actually led to the level yet where they are actually destroying it, although we have to be constantly vigilant for it. And that is why one of my personal roles when I speak on law school campuses and college campuses and whatnot is to try to reinforce young Americans to be proud of their American tradition and to get up and to stand and to defend traditional American institutions such as the Supreme Court, the Senate, and right on down to the state and local level as well.
Thank you for that. So with that, I think it's time for closing statements. I guess we can go in the opposite order of which we started. That makes sense, and we can end with the rabbi because, as I said at the beginning, bookends Torah, bookends everything, lays the foundation, and tells us how to apply in the real world. So, with that being said, and if we could try bring it down to a practical level, if I think that would be helpful to people. Some practical advice for people who are going to sit or stand in the voting boxes and actually cast their ballot. That would be helpful. So, if we could start with Dr. Joel, if you want to go, we have to let you unmute. And you can just give us no more than 3 minutes, if possible. Practical.
I'll do one or two.
Okay.
But, this has been a fantastic conversation. It's amazing to have the voices in this conversation that we have. Very, very valuable sets of contributions and different ideas. I think that the encounter with anti-Semitism always has a few things in common with it throughout Jewish history. And we're obviously at a moment of that again, where when the world is in disarray and trying to figure out what it is, usually anti-Semitism comes to bear to leverage a set of projections against Jews who are put in charge of trying to figure that out for everybody else and themselves. And that's essentially what happened in Egypt, where the whole world economy had to be transformed by Joseph. And that's exactly what happened again in World War II, when you had people like Jacob Robinson who were creating the framework of human rights while they were writing the first constitutions for Zionism in order to and in charge of the prosecution in Nuremberg in order to develop a new world order that could work for everybody and make sure that it's a place where Jews aren't getting thrown into ovens. We're there again. Somehow we're there again. Right. And the encounter with anti-Semitism is always transformative. After we left, we came into Mitzrayim slaves. We left Tzivaot. We left as a host. When Mordechai, when Haman is talking about the Jewish people, he says they're scattered. And what does he do when it's time to confront this? He gathers them together. It is crucial that the Jewish people collect themselves now in ways that we have the technological capacity, certainly. We have the mental capacity, certainly. We have the resources. It is crucial that we take the time that we have in order to synchronize and make our efforts harmonious to work against what's happening collectively. Right, that has to be both here and it's as a quad being Jewish, quad being part of a Jewish network. He said that is what is so hard to believe is possible. If people don't believe that's possible until they see it. But it's what we've but for us, that isn't something that is outside the bounds of what we do. That's what we do. That's what we've done every single time the cards are down. That isn't the exception for us. That's the rule. Okay, so we're going to do it again. Okay, we're going to do that again. And what it's going to look like is what's happening now in public schools. While this is a problem for everyone else, while it's darkness for everyone else, the lights are on in Goshen, guys. Okay, we can actually figure out what this looks like. Okay, and it's coming for us, so we better do that. Okay, and it's going to be coming for us, by the way, everywhere. We can see from October 7th that it's coming in Israel. And it's coming here. And by the way, because of many things David said, the whole world's going to start looking like that. So we'd better figure out how to solve it, because we're the ones that are always in charge of building the next world order. That's why I'm so convinced we can win this, David. These dragons are big, but they have a lot of gold. Okay, and I'm pretty sure that in defeating the problems that we have, we defeat them not just for ourselves, we defeat them for everybody. And that's not just because we're universally concerned. It's because we're particular. It's because we come together as a people to do that we can instrumentalize those behaviors. Okay, so we fundamentally disagree. We need to continue disagreeing. Okay, because I think we see many of the same problems, and it's often the case even now that when people have fights, the biggest problem they have is that they're not having the conflict honestly. They're not really being honest about what the fight's about. They're too busy worried about Haitians eating pets or staged assassinations. Hakol Kol Yaakov, guys. We can talk. We can talk this through. Okay, thanks.
Perfect timing. Next we can go to Josh. I think that's the right order, right? I think I went that way. I hope.
Sure. So yeah, this has been a wonderful, at times discursive, and nonetheless always enlightening conversation. Look, as far as practical takeaways here, I think that we are asking the right questions by touching on some of the third rail topics, such as the future of Jewish life in America here. I think we would not be doing our job, frankly, if we were not kind of broaching that. And I would be lying to you if I were to say that we're not having all sorts of internal thoughts about these very topics myself, which I do very frequently, again, including after incidents such as this past Wednesday, when I was physically struck by at least one pro-Hamas lunatic while surrounded by 25 to 30 keffiyeh-clad Hamasniks in Chicago. So I am definitely asking myself a lot of these very questions as well. No doubt about that there. But I'm not ready to call it quits yet. I am not ready to call it quits yet. Ask me 20, 30 years from now, maybe I'll have a different answer. God willing, Bezrat Hashem, I will not have a different answer, and that it will start to look a little bit better there. The point here is, for relevant purposes, that public policy, the law, and the rule of law more generally have a tremendous role to play when it comes to shaping the hearts and sentiments and general sensibilities of our fellow American citizens. The law is not just descriptive, it is also prescriptive. It is very much also a teacher, and it can be used to inculcate certain virtues and habits of mind. And that's a somewhat kind of lawyerly academic way of saying that when you try to get out there this Tuesday or before then, what you should be looking for on the ballot is people that are going to use their platform, to use their policy-making abilities, and to be able to sculpt laws or to enact laws or to interpret laws when it comes to the judicial branch that ultimately conduce to the shared Judeo-Christian inheritance of this country in a way that also conduces to the future of Jewish life in this country, U.S.-Israel relations, religious liberty, First Amendment values here in America, things of all that as well. And this is not a partisan event, and I'm not gonna do that, Giddy. Don't worry, anything there. But without naming names or anything like that, I guess all I would say to you is that we do live in a time, unfortunately, from my vantage points, where some things that we once really did take for granted all across the spectrum, such as religious liberty for minority religions, is increasingly, not necessarily, a ubiquitous issue. That is increasingly somewhat of a charged and contentious issue, because sometimes it is seen as potentially being in an irreconcilable loggerheads of sorts with some sort of competing value, such as a woke value or insert your other kind of modern value. So again, I don't want to get into too many specifics here in my closing remarks, but these are all the sorts of things that, from my vantage point, you ought to be considering when you go to make your vote, if you have not already done so. And just to kind of underscore something that Malcolm said earlier, please really do go out and vote if you have not done so. It really is kind of your imperative as someone who lives in what is, in my estimation, bar none, the greatest country in the world, along with the state of Israel itself, of course.
Thank you, Josh. Especially thank you for keeping it nonpartisan. But I will say that for anyone who's interested in Josh's take on where you should be voting, I highly recommend his fantastic podcast, The Josh Hammer Show, as well as his Newsweek articles. He is an opinion writer for them and very, very good writer. I often find myself reading his work. So I definitely recommend, if you're interested in what Josh has to say as to which party you should vote for. So you gave me one and I'll give you one, Josh. And now, David, if you could give us your closing thoughts.
Sure. I've said more than my fair share, so I'll surprise you by being brief. You should vote. We should use the power we have. We should use the resources we have to the best effect we can. We should vote with as much thought. I've put more thought into this election than I put collectively in all previous elections. I got an absentee ballot. I studied it. I researched it all the way down the line, and I've never done that before. And I think it is a consequential thing, and I think that the power to vote is incredibly important. But I think that we should also, the message I give to people is that our generation, my generation, we should do what we can here. What I tell my children is that, please God, their children should be born in Israel. That we have the opportunity to create a great nation, living by Torah, living in an authentically Jewish place. And we have a role to play here in America, but I think the next generation and the generation that follows has a more important role to play in Eretz Israel for the Jewish people. So, and I think we should follow the words of Kohelet. With all the intellectual things we do, all the things we strive for materially, intellectually, hedonistically, we should just, first and foremost, fear God and live by Torah. And if we can do that and we can teach that to our children, I think that whatever problems we have, we'll be able to face, we'll be able to overcome. And I think that we'll have, whether redemption is now or sometime in the future, I think we will merit it if we focus on the next generation, teaching them the things they should be doing what we can here, but creating a future for them in the Holy Land with the Jewish nation.
Great. Thank you, David. Malcolm, if you would like to give us concluding thoughts, and if you have it, I sent you the letter from Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein.
I'm not able to, I don't see it. I can't read it. So
Okay,
read
I
it
sent
there.
you.
Let me just say a few things first.
Sure.
First of all, on a practical step, as I said, I think the most important thing is to go vote, take your children or grandchildren, to educate them, to show them what you're doing and why you're doing it. When you go to the voting booth, first thing you should do, look over your shoulder, make sure nobody's watching you, and then go and cast your vote on an intelligent way, based upon the values. I think, we have one system of government now. There's a lot of glorification of monarchy right now. We've had good experience and bad experience. We know it's good to be a king, but it also can be very bad for the people when you have a king Jewish king or non-Jewish king, who doesn't share the values and the Torah values that we would want to see. And when we look at the world as a whole, look at Europe. There is no hope in Europe for us, for Jews in Europe in the long run. There is no way it can be redeemed. And we don't want to see America go that way. I believe the future of the Jewish people is in Israel, But for now, and being practical and being pragmatic, you have to look at what the United States and the majority of Jews who are here will remain here. And we have to utilize our political clout, build alliances with others who share our values so that we isolate those who don't. It does matter who wins. It is a fact. It matters, and it matters who will control Congress. It matters on all the grounds that we looked at. People have made several references to the story of Purim. What made Haman think that he could do what his grandfather Amalek couldn't do in terms to the Jewish people? Because he said, Amu Fuzar Mufarad. There are people that are separated, they're spread out, they were not united. That is what the enemy saw with the demonstrations in Israel. They saw that the Jewish people, they thought, were disunited and would not be able to come together. And the antidote was when Esther said, Lech Kenosis Kol HaYudim. She didn't say these Jews or those Jews. She said Kol HaYudim. All of the Jews had to be brought together. And that's the challenge for us today. We are going to face immense challenges. The state of Israel is going to face burdens that are almost unimaginable. All of the wounded, all the widows, all the orphans, all of the things that will have to be done to rebuild. And it's a must. I believe, on an optimistic note, and I told the Prime Minister last November, there will be a surge of people making Aliyah from Europe because they have to, from America, half Aliyah because they want to, and because they will know that their future is there. Their children will go to school there because they can't find places here in most universities. And I know Mr. Magerman and others have been involved are starting English language courses so to facilitate it for American Jewish kids to be able to go to school in Israel and be safe and be part of the society and stay there and build the state of Israel. There will be a post-war surge, but Israel will need the resources to prepare for it. So we have to look at the day after the election in our communities to make sure that police and all the security relationships that we have are in place and intact, because I can easily see demonstrations starting by those who've been conducting these violent demonstrations for the past year. And most of all, that people it doesn't end with the election, it begins with the election, that they get involved and they begin to build a political power, and you see the opportunities, run for office, get the right kind of people who stand for principles and from people who believe in Torah values, who can be spokespeople and responsible representatives for our community, and to find non-Jews and others who share our values, who would be willing who could stand up and run and be voices for us in the future. I believe that the future will be bright. Look at the price of real estate in Yerushalayim. It's gone through the roof. It tells you something. People are coming. People are buying. All of you buy places in Israel now because it's only going to get more expensive. And know that our future rests on that, on Israel, on its vitality. And for now, that depends on our being strong in America.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. I'm going to share now in the chat this incredible interview of Malcolm's on the Meaningful People podcast. It's unbelievable. You hear a fantastic story about Malcolm and President Biden, as well as many other presidents. It's definitely worth your time listening. Before I hand over to the Rabbi to say the last word, on behalf of Ohad and myself, we want to thank the fantastic panelists, Malcolm, David, Josh, and Dr. Joel, for your incredible insights. It's been a spirited discussion, and we've loved every single second of it. As Malcolm said, this is the turning point. Lech Kenosis Kol HaYehudim. Bring all the Jews together, the ones that agree, that disagree, and sit in a room and hash out our differences. That's the only way we can get through this. And before we leave, remember about the dinner if you're interested. 50th year Yovel celebration, December 1st in Miami. You can see Rabbi Zweig in person there if you wanted to meet him. He'll give you at least a minute of your time to listen to whatever you want to talk to him about. So it's a good way to get a conversation with him, is to be there at the dinner. And I think that's all from us. Rabbi Zweig, if you'll give us the last word on the Torah perspective.
First of all, thank you so much, Gidi Ohad, for putting this fantastic program together. I am truly honored and proud of the entire discussion and panel that we have and the students of the Yeshiva. It's a unique aspect of our Yeshiva in general, speaks very much to my father and his vision for bringing Jews together, which is really how I want to conclude what I think we are really here to do, which is to help the Jewish people, which is what God wants from the Jewish people. God wants his children to help each other. I have the privilege of knowing many of the people on the call. So many of them are students of Talmudic University. There's quite a number that I don't know, but I'm getting to a specific point about this. Several of them actually are our non-Jewish friends in Pennsylvania, where the yeshiva now has an outpost, a campus, and they have become both friends, supporters, learners, listeners, and I regularly study with them when I'm in Pennsylvania. And we have also just a number of people that have become students of the yeshiva later in life, a number on this call. And I say all of that to point out that the word, which is God's word, is the most powerful weapon and most permanent feature of the universe. God created the world through the words, and the Torah is the word of Hashem. That is the most enduring force of creation. And as Malcolm referenced many times, and everybody did, Josh, Bezrat Hashem, we need Hashem, we need his word, and that's what will get all of us to the better place that we need as a Jewish people and as an entire world. So practical advice, how to help our Jewish nation. Of course, vote, part of everything that everybody's spoken of. Some of you stole my thunder. I actually went today to vote early, intentionally on a Sunday, so that I could take our children with us. And let me tell you, waiting an hour in line with a 1.5-year-old that doesn't understand what's going on, and a 7-year-old, and an almost 8-year-old, and almost 10-year-old, it's not so easy. So I did it very intentionally because of the importance of everything that we've spoken about tonight, but really it's about educating the next generation, as David spoke of. We have institutions of almost 1,000 students, basically 1,000 on a daily basis, not to mention all the other ones that don't get counted. And, our Jewish education institutions in America need so much financial help. Everything is skyrocketed. And as it stands right now, Jewish day schools in America, somewhere between 5 to 10% of Jews in America are getting education in a Jewish day school. And that's really not an acceptable number. We need to do much better because, again, it's about Jews helping Jews, and we need to help the Jews become who they can be so they can be the lights unto the world that so many Jews have become. We need to do so much better at that. And so my points of practical advice is spread the word. Everybody on this call is a thought leader, and you need to develop your own thought-led groups, followers. Josh is doing incredible work. David, I beginning to hear about all the work that you've done, and Malcolm has inspired generations and presidents of all of our lifetimes. That's just an amazing thing, and he's taking his time and his energy to help the rest of us, stoke that passion and continue to pass it forward. So the Torah thoughts are that in order for Jews to really help each other, the first thing we need to do is pick 2 things that we need to improve on, because it's called repentance. And every Jew should be on the Jewish journey of repentance. 2 things that we can do better. We need to spread Torah learning, like these conversations, Torah thoughts, Torah ideas. So many of us, have familiarity, and so many Jews don't. We need to do that. We need to figure out ways to get the Jewish people to work together, like we're doing on this call. I think honestly, I think we should do one of these every week. There's so many things that we need to address, and there's so many more people that we can bring on, and we need Jews to connect to each other, to be collaborative with each other, because so much more can be accomplished. I also think security in Eretz Yisrael, of course, is so paramount for Eretz Yisrael, for the Jews worldwide. There's no question that we need Eretz Yisrael to succeed, to help Jews everywhere, and we need Jews everywhere to help Eretz Yisrael. But we need to do it, meaning we need to think of strategies that will improve the security without thought of personal gain as part of that equation. Whatever it takes to make the situation for Jews better in their security, we need to do. And then finally, we have to remind ourselves and our fellow Jews that being Jewish is the privilege to be the ones responsible to bring the message of objective truth, God's wisdom, loving kindness, morality, and true human rights and dignity to all mankind. We need to remember that this is a global message. We need it for the Jews, and the Jews have a responsibility to do that for the world. Thank you all so much.
But you can end the recording.